A millionaire spends the night with a homeless girl at his house. The next morning, when he is shocked to find that she has left, leaving only waves of rain battered the windshield, each drop acting like a relentless percussionist with no rhythm but endless persistence. Austin Holland leaned forward slightly, his fingers tightening around the steering wheel of the sleek black car. The city outside was a smear of light and shadow, blurred by the unyielding storm. New York, ever chaotic by day, now seemed subdued, like a restless giant forced into uneasy slumber. He exhaled sharply, the sound lost in the muted hum of classical music playing through the car's speakers. Tonight had been another gala, another sea of empty conversations and champagne flutes clinking over hollow laughter. Austin had smiled, nodded, and played his part. Now, alone in the silence, his jaw ached from the forced expressions, and his chest felt heavy with a weight he couldn't name. The stoplight ahead blinked red, casting a dim glow over the deserted intersection. Austin slowed, his gaze drifting from the rain-slick road to the sidewalk beyond. Under the flickering halo of a broken street lamp, a figure huddled close to the brick facade of a boarded-up shop. He squinted. A girl, young, barely more than a shadow wrapped in tattered layers. She hugged her knees to her chest, her hair plastered to her face in dark streaks by the rain. For a moment, she didn't move, as though frozen in the storm's grasp. Austin's stomach twisted. He'd seen this before. This raw image of survival etched into the city's skin. He'd trained himself to look away, to drive past the broken lives and whispered tragedies scattered across the streets. New York wasn't kind, and kindness rarely thrived here. The car behind him honked, snapping him out of his daze. The light had turned green. Austin pressed the gas, tearing his gaze from the girl as his car surged forward. It wasn't his problem. He'd told himself that before, and told himself now. People made their choices, or at least that's what he'd been conditioned to believe. But as the rain blurred the rearview mirror, her image clung to him like the misted glass, haunting, unwavering. 2 blocks later, his hands tightened on the wheel, and he slammed the brakes. The car skidded slightly, tires protesting against the wet asphalt. His heart pounded, but not from the abrupt stop. "Damn it," he muttered, gripping the wheel like it was the only tether to his resolve. Reversing, he retraced his path, the rain swallowing the sound of his engine. The girl hadn't moved. As Austin pulled up beside her, his headlights illuminated the fragile form curled tightly against the cold. She flinched, shielding her eyes with an arm. He rolled down the passenger window, rain splattering into the car. "Hey!" His voice echoed louder than he had intended, sounding harsh against the raging storm. She didn't respond, just shrank further into herself. Austin sighed, his breath visible in the chill. "You're going to freeze out here," he called, softer this time. "Do you have somewhere to go?" Her head tilted slightly, and for the first time, she looked at him. Wide, dark eyes, rimmed with exhaustion, locked onto his, filled with both suspicion and resignation. "I'm fine," she murmured, though her voice barely carried over the rain. "No, you're not." Austin leaned forward, his own words surprising him. "You can't stay here all night. Let me help." She stared at him, unmoving, before shaking her head slowly. "Why would you care?" The question struck him deeply. What motivated him to care? Because her trembling form reminded him of something he didn't want to remember. Because guilt had a way of crawling out of the shadows at the worst times. He didn't have an answer, she'd believe. "Look," he said finally, exhaling heavily, "I'm not asking for anything. Just get in the car. Get warm. One night." Her hesitation was palpable, tension crackling in the air between them. Then, with a cautious, almost reluctant motion, she pushed herself up, her sodden boots slipping on the wet pavement. Austin reached over and popped the door open. The car seemed cavernous as she slid inside, clutching the oversized coat he offered. She didn't meet his eyes again, shrinking into the corner of the seat. Austin stole a glance at her as he pulled back onto the road. Her frame, small and hunched, seemed almost swallowed by the leather interior. "What's your name?" he asked, after a long silence. "Betty," she said quietly, the word brittle as glass. "Well, Betty," he said, eyes fixed on the road ahead, "let's get you warm and dry." The rest of the drive passed in silence, save for the rhythmic thrum of the rain. When they arrived, Austin's townhouse loomed tall and stark against the storm. He held the door open as Betty hesitated on the threshold, her gaze darting between him and the unfamiliar sanctuary. "Come on," he urged gently. She stepped inside, dripping water onto the polished marble floor. Austin grabbed a blanket and handed it to her, without a word. The house felt unusually still as he watched her curl up on the couch, clutching the fabric like a shield. He stood for a moment, torn between retreating and staying, before heading to his room. Sleep wouldn't come easily tonight, not with the ghost of her question echoing in his mind. Why would you care? The scent of roasted vegetables mingled with the quiet crackle of the stovetop as Austin worked in the kitchen. The silence in the house felt heavier than usual, stretching uncomfortably as the storm outside lashed against the windows. Every so often, he glanced toward the living room, where Betty sat on the edge of the couch, her posture rigid, the blanket still clutched tightly around her. She hadn't said much since stepping into his home. Her words were sparse, guarded, like a locked door he didn't have the key to. Even now, as she sat mere feet away, it was as though she were miles distant, her gaze fixed on the empty fireplace. Austin cleared his throat as he set 2 plates on the dining table. "Dinner's ready," he said, trying to keep his tone casual. Betty hesitated, her body tense, before finally standing. She approached the table cautiously, her steps slow and deliberate, as if entering an unfamiliar battlefield. When she sat, she kept her eyes on the plate in front of her, avoiding his gaze entirely. Austin was seated across from her, picking up his fork. "I hope you like roasted chicken," he said, aiming for something neutral. "It's not fancy, but it's warm." Betty nodded slightly, but didn't reach for her utensils. Instead, she stared at the steam rising from the food, her fingers curling tightly around the edge of the table. "So," Austin began after a moment, searching for something to fill the silence. "How long have you been in New York?" Betty's eyes flickered up, just briefly before darting back down. "A while." The 2 words hung in the air, their finality leaving little room for follow-up. Austin shifted in his chair, setting his fork down as he tried again. "It's a tough city," he offered. "I mean, it has its moments, but it's not easy." Betty let out a soft, humorless laugh, the sound brittle. "That's an understatement." Her voice was quiet, yet there was a sharp edge to it, a barrier carefully constructed to keep him at arm's length. Austin leaned back slightly, unsure how to respond. For a man who had mastered the art of negotiation and reading people, he found himself at a loss with her. "I'm just saying—" He hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "If you ever need a place to—" "I don't," Betty cut in, her tone sharper than she intended. She glanced up quickly, her expression flashing with regret, before she looked away again. "I mean, I don't want to overstay." Austin watched her, noting the way her shoulders hunched slightly, as if bracing for an argument that never came. "It's not about that," he said after a pause. "You're not overstaying. You're welcome here, for as long as you need." Betty's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. Why? The question was simple, yet it carried the weight of every doubt, every suspicion she held. Why would a stranger extend kindness without any apparent conditions? Austin opened his mouth to answer, but found himself faltering. Why indeed? Because he'd seen something in her that reminded him of someone. Because guilt was an insidious thing, clawing its way to the surface, no matter how deeply he tried to bury it. I guess. He shrugged, looking away. Sometimes people just need a little help. Betty didn't respond. The room fell into an uneasy silence, broken only by the occasional clink of utensils against plates. She finally took a tentative bite of the food, her movements slow and measured, as though unsure if it was safe to relax. Austin, in turn, focused on his plate, though his appetite had waned. He found himself hyper-aware of every move she made, the way her hands trembled slightly when she lifted her fork, the way her eyes darted toward the door every few minutes, as though planning an escape route. By the time they finished eating, the tension between them had only grown thicker. Austin cleared the dishes, his movements deliberate, as he tried to think of something, anything, to say that wouldn't send her retreating further into herself. But the right words never came. Later that night, Austin stood at the base of the stairs, a glass of bourbon in his hand. From his vantage point, he could see Betty curled up on the couch, the blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She sat upright, stiff and alert, her gaze fixed on the darkened fireplace. The oversized cushions barely made room for her petite frame. And yet, there was a quiet resilience about her, a defiance in the way she held herself, as though daring the world to knock her down again. Austin's grip on the glass tightened. He didn't know why he cared so much, why he'd felt compelled to stop for her on that rain-soaked street. But as he watched her from the shadows, he realized that she reminded him of something, or someone, he'd been trying to forget. The storm outside raged on, but inside, the house was eerily still. Austin took a long sip of his bourbon, the burn doing little to ease the knot in his chest. Whatever this was, this pull, this sense of obligation, it wasn't something he could ignore. The smell of coffee hit him first, warm and unexpected, as Austin stirred awake. Sunlight filtered through the half-drawn curtains, casting pale streaks across the wooden floor. For a fleeting moment, he allowed himself the thought that maybe things were normal. However, the lack of sound conveyed a distinct message. The house was too quiet, too still. Austin swung his legs over the edge of the bed, his feet meeting the cool floor as he rose and headed downstairs. The faint aroma of roasted coffee grew stronger as he approached the kitchen. His steps faltered at the doorway. The kitchen, usually a state of casual disarray, looked immaculate. The counters had been wiped clean, and the dishes from last night washed and stacked neatly to dry. On the island sat a plate of scrambled eggs and toast, the steam still faintly rising. Beside it, a folded note rested, edges slightly crumpled as though it had been gripped tightly before being set down. Austin hesitated, the quiet around him amplifying the rapid thud of his heartbeat. Slowly, he picked up the note and unfolded it. Austin, thank you for everything. The meal, the roof, and the kindness. It's more than anyone has shown me in a long time. I don't want to take advantage of your generosity. So I'm leaving. I'll be okay. Please don't worry about me. Betty. Her words were plain, unadorned, but they carried a weight that pressed heavily on him. Austin stared at the note for a long moment, his fingers tightening around the paper. He glanced toward the couch where she had slept. The blanket was folded neatly at one end, her presence erased as though she had never been there. The knot in his chest tightened. He didn't understand why it bothered him so much. She was a stranger, someone he'd helped out of impulse, perhaps out of guilt. He'd done his part. So why did her absence feel like something had been ripped away? Austin set the note down with deliberate care and stepped outside. The storm from the previous night had left the streets damp, the air crisp with the scent of wet asphalt. He climbed into his car, gripping the steering wheel as his thoughts churned. "I'll be okay," she'd written. But her words had sounded more like a plea than a promise. The search began with uncertainty, driven more by instinct than any real plan. Austin drove through the city, scanning sidewalks, parks, and alleyways for a glimpse of her. He stopped at shelters and soup kitchens, asking after a young woman matching Betty's description. Each time, he was met with blank stares and shrugs. By the third day, frustration mixed with something deeper, an ache he couldn't quite name. The city, vast and unyielding, appeared determined to engulf her completely. He couldn't stop replaying their brief conversations in his mind, her hesitant voice, the way her eyes darted to the door as though preparing for an escape. He couldn't let it end like this. It was on the fourth evening, when his hope had begun to waver, that he spotted her. Austin had pulled into a small, unremarkable diner on the city's outskirts, the kind of place where the scent of grease clung to the air, and the vinyl booths were faded from years of use. He slid into a corner seat, exhaustion weighing on him, and then he saw her. Betty was behind the counter, her hair tied back in a messy ponytail, wearing an oversized apron that dwarfed her small frame. She moved with quiet efficiency, balancing a tray of dishes, as though trying to make herself invisible. Her face was focused, her expression unreadable, but there was a heaviness in the way she carried herself. Austin's breath caught. He didn't move immediately, letting the sight of her sink in. She looked different here, surrounded by the clatter of plates and the soft hum of conversation. She seemed smaller somehow, yet there was something unyielding in her presence, a quiet determination that contrasted starkly with the weary lines on her face. When Betty turned, her eyes briefly swept the diner before landing on him. For a moment, they both froze. Recognition flashed in her gaze, followed by something else, something guarded. Austin stood slowly, the chair scraping against the floor as he rose. She didn't move, her tray balanced precariously in her hands, as though caught between flight and confrontation. He crossed the room with deliberate steps, his pulse loud in his ears. When he reached the counter, he stopped, leaving enough space for her to breathe. "Betty," he said quietly. His voice, though steady, carried a depth of emotion he hadn't intended. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her fingers tightening on the tray. "Austin." The single word hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken questions and the weight of everything that had been left unsaid. The diner buzzed softly with the clinking of silverware and muted chatter, but between Austin and Betty, the air was thick with tension. Her tray trembled slightly in her grip, though her eyes remained locked on his, a flicker of wariness betraying her otherwise calm exterior. "You found me," she said, her voice low, almost accusatory. Austin nodded. "I wasn't going to stop looking." Betty glanced around, as if searching for an escape route. "Why?" He paused, his mouth opening and closing as he tried to put words to the compulsion that had driven him here. "Because I couldn't leave things the way they were," he said finally, his tone measured, earnest. "You're not just someone I passed on the street, Betty." She blinked, seemingly taken aback by his directness, but before she could respond, the gruff voice of a cook called from the kitchen, "Betty, breaks up." She glanced over her shoulder, then back at Austin, her hesitation palpable. "Wait for me outside," she said quickly, the words almost reluctant. Austin nodded, stepping away and heading toward the exit. The cool evening air swept over him as he pushed the door open. He found himself pacing the small patch of sidewalk in front of the diner, his mind racing. What would he say? Could he convince her to trust him? The door creaked open behind him, and Betty emerged, still wearing her oversized apron, her arms crossed protectively over her chest. "I've got 10 minutes, she said flatly, leaning against the brick wall beside the door. "Say what you need to." Austin turned to face her, the words he'd rehearsed on the drive here, evaporating under her sharp gaze. "I wanted to make sure you were okay," he began, his voice steady, but softer now. "When I woke up and found you gone, I couldn't stop thinking about what might happen to you out there." "I've been out there for a long time," she said, her tone edged with bitterness. "I've managed." "I'm not saying you haven't," Austin replied quickly, his hands raised slightly, palms open. "But you shouldn't have to. You deserve more than just surviving, Betty." Her jaw tightened and she looked away, her eyes scanning the darkening horizon. "I don't have a degree. I barely finished high school. What kind of more do you think I can get?" Austin stepped closer, his tone shifting from cautious to determined. "Work for me." Betty let out a short, incredulous laugh, shaking her head. "Doing what? Cleaning your house? Driving your car?" "No," he said firmly. "As my assistant. You'll learn on the job how to handle scheduling, meetings, and communications. I'll teach you everything you need to know." She turned to him, her arms tightening around herself. "Why me? You could hire someone with actual qualifications, someone who wouldn't mess it up in C." "Because I believe in you," Austin said, the words hanging heavy in the air between them. "I see potential in you, Betty. You're resourceful, resilient, and you don't back down. Those are qualities I can't teach." Her guarded expression flickered, a crack appearing in the walls she'd so carefully built. "And what if I fail?" she asked softly, her voice barely audible above a whisper. "Then you'll try again," Austin said simply, "and I'll be there to help you." Betty studied him for a long moment, her gaze searching his for any hint of insincerity. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the faintest tremor of vulnerability. "I've spent so long not trusting anyone, Austin. I don't know how to just believe someone like you." "I'm not asking you to believe me right away," he said, his voice steady. "Just give it a chance. Give yourself a chance." The faint sound of the diner door swinging open broke the moment, and Betty glanced toward it. Her break was over. "I'll think about it," she said finally, her tone cautious but not dismissive. Austin nodded, a small flicker of hope sparking within him. "That's all I ask." She turned, her hand on the door handle, but before stepping inside, she looked back at him, her expression softer than it had been. "Thank you," she said quietly, and then she was gone, the door closing behind her with a soft jingle of the bell. Austin exhaled deeply, his breath visible in the cool air. He didn't know if she would take his offer, but for the first time since finding her gone, he felt like they were moving forward, tentatively, but forward. As he walked back to his car, the night seemed a little less heavy, the world a little less indifferent. And somewhere inside, a part of him began to hope, not just for her, but for himself. Betty's hesitant, "I'll think about it," sets the stage for her eventual decision, leaving the reader with anticipation for her next steps and the promise of a slow but meaningful journey. The park bench was cold beneath her, the kind of chill that seeped through her jeans and reminded her of nights spent without a roof. Betty sat with her knees drawn up, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. The city moved around her, dog walkers, joggers, couples lost in quiet conversation, but it all felt distant, like a movie she was only half watching. Austin's offer echoed in her mind, circling endlessly. "Why me?" she had asked, and his answer, calm, steady, unshakable, had left a mark she couldn't ignore. "You're resilient. You don't back down." Her fingers tightened on the fabric of her jacket. She yearned to trust him, to believe that she was more than a mere survivor. But doubts clung to her like the biting wind. What if he was wrong? What if she walked into his world and proved every fear, every insecurity right? A gust of wind rattled the bare branches above her. She looked up at the pale sky, the grey clouds moving too fast, as though they, too, were fleeing something unseen. Betty sighed and stood, her steps slow but deliberate as she left the park. She didn't know where she was going until she saw the payphone booth at the edge of the street, its scratched glass and faded paint barely standing out against the urban sprawl. Her fingers trembled slightly as she fed the machine with coins. She hesitated for a breath before dialing the number Austin had given her. The line clicked, and his voice came through, warm but tinged with surprise. "Betty!" "I'll do it," she said, her voice steady but soft. "I'll come to work for you." There was silence on the other end, just long enough for her heart to tighten. Then his reply came, clear and certain. "You won't regret it." Betty hung up, her grip loosening on the receiver as she exhaled. For the first time in a long while, she felt something faint and unfamiliar: hope. Betty stood at the entrance of Austin's company, dwarfed by the sleek glass facade and bustling energy of the office within. People streamed through the revolving doors, each with an air of purpose, their hurried steps contrasting sharply with her hesitant shuffle. She adjusted the strap of her worn bag on her shoulder, biting her lip. Behind her, Austin's voice broke the silence. "Welcome to my world," he said, a hint of pride softening his usually measured tone. Betty turned to him, her brows furrowed. "This is yours?" He nodded, gesturing toward the building. "All of it. Started it from scratch." Her eyes swept over the polished lobby and the sea of professionals moving with unspoken coordination. It felt overwhelming, almost alien, and the thought of stepping inside made her stomach knot. "You didn't tell me it was this big." Austin smiled faintly. "Would it have made a difference?" She shrugged, but didn't answer. "Come on," he urged gently, placing a hand on the door. "You've got this." The office's hum enveloped her, like a powerful wave. Phones rang, heels clicked against polished floors, and conversations overlapped in a steady rhythm. The space was expansive, modern, and efficient, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the city below. Betty instinctively hunched her shoulders, shrinking into herself as she followed Austin through the chaos. They stopped at his office, a room that contrasted sharply with the rest of the building. It was warm, filled with books, personal photographs, and a hint of disarray that felt oddly comforting. Austin gestured toward the chair across from his desk. "Have a seat." Betty sank into the chair, her posture stiff. She glanced at the shelves lining the walls, her gaze lingering on a framed photograph of Austin, younger and smiling, alongside another man. "That's my first partner," Austin said, noticing her gaze. His tone shifted, the warmth fading slightly. "Back when this place was just an idea." Betty didn't press, sensing the weight behind his words. Instead, she focused on the task ahead. "So, what exactly do you want me to do here?" Austin leaned forward, clasping his hands together. "You'll shadow me for now. Gain knowledge and skills in various areas. Scheduling, correspondence, handling meetings. Nothing you can't pick up with time." She hesitated, her hands gripping the armrests. "I told you before, I didn't go to college. I don't know anything about this." "And I told you," he countered gently, "what matters isn't what you don't know. It's what you're willing to learn." Betty stared at him, her wariness mingling with the faintest glimmer of hope. "I don't want to screw this up." "You won't," Austin said, his voice steady. "And even if you stumble, we'll figure it out. Together." The first week was a blur of information, missteps, and small victories. Betty fumbled with the phone system, accidentally deleted an email draft, and got lost twice in the labyrinth of hallways. But she also started to find her footing, piecing together the rhythms of the office. She memorized meeting schedules, learned how to organize files efficiently, and even managed to calm a particularly impatient client over the phone. Each evening, as the office emptied and the city lights flickered to life outside the windows, Austin would sit with her, reviewing the day. He was patient, offering guidance without judgment, his steady presence a source of reassurance she hadn't realized she needed. For Austin, watching Betty adapt was both a relief and a revelation. Something about Betty, her quiet determination and her refusal to back down from challenges, reminded him of someone he couldn't quite place. Her resilience was matched by the spark in her eyes when she solved a problem, and the guarded pride she tried to hide when she got something right. One evening, as Betty was packing up for the day, Austin found himself staring at the photograph on his desk, the one of him and his former partner, Thomas. The memory stirred with uneasiness, its edges sharper than he'd anticipated. The resemblance wasn't physical, but it was there, in the way Betty carried herself, in the flashes of defiance that broke through her reserved demeanor. "Austin!" Betty's voice pulled him back to the present. She stood in the doorway, her bag slung over one shoulder. "Everything okay?" He blinked, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just thinking." She nodded, not pressing, and left with a quiet, "Good night." Alone in the office, Austin sat back in his chair, the photograph still catching his eye. The connection he was beginning to sense felt unsettling, as though the past was creeping into the present, uninvited. Austin's growing bond with Betty stirs dormant memories of his past with Thomas, leaving him grappling with emotions he hasn't yet named. Meanwhile, Betty's slow adjustment signals the start of a journey she doesn't yet realize will change her life. Are you back to work after the New Year holidays? If you're back to work, comment cookies. And if you're still enjoying the holidays, write sponge cake. The office was unusually quiet that evening, the usual hum of activity replaced by the soft rustle of papers and the occasional sigh from Betty. She sat at the desk outside Austin's office, flipping through a stack of documents he'd asked her to organize. Her movements were deliberate, her brow furrowed in concentration. Austin glanced at her through the half-open door, the sight stirring an odd mix of pride and unease. It had been weeks since Betty had joined him, and though her progress was undeniable, her guarded demeanor lingered, a quiet reminder of the walls she still held firmly in place. "Betty," he called softly, stepping out into the open. She looked up, startled, but quickly composed herself. "Take a break. Come in for a bit." She hesitated before nodding, pushing her chair back and following him into his office. Austin gestured to the couch by the window rather than the formal chairs by his desk. He poured them both a glass of water and sat opposite her, the city lights sprawling behind him. "You've been doing well," he began, his tone warm. "I know this hasn't been easy for you." Betty offered a faint smile, her hands clasped tightly around the glass. "It's different. However, I believe I'm beginning to understand it." He nodded, waiting for her to continue, but the silence stretched between them. Then, to his surprise, she spoke again, her voice quieter. Betty hesitated, her hand stilling. "Do you have siblings?" The question surprised him. "No," he said simply, unsure where the conversation was heading. She nodded slowly, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I did," she murmured. "An older brother." My brother, he used to say that too. You'll get the hang of it, Em. You always do. She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. He believed in me when no one else did. Austin leaned forward slightly, his attention sharpening. Your brother? Thomas, she said, her tone softening with the weight of memory. He was everything to me. After our parents died, he took care of me, gave up so much to make sure I was okay. Austin's chest tightened as the name settled in the air between them. He stayed silent, letting her continue. He was smart, you know? Ambitious. Always had these big ideas. She traced the rim of her glass absently, her gaze distant. He wanted to build something, to prove he could, and he almost did. But then, her voice faltered, her eyes lowering. He was in a car accident, 7 years ago. The words struck Austin with a forceful impact, causing his breath to become trapped in his throat. A car accident, he repeated, his voice barely audible above a whisper. Betty nodded. He left work late one night after a tiring day, distracted. He didn't see the truck coming. Her grip on the glass tightened, her knuckles white. It wasn't fair. He was only 28. He had so much ahead of him. I was in high school, Betty continued. It was sudden. One day he was there and the next... She trailed off, shaking her head. After that, everything fell apart. Austin's hands trembled as he set his glass down, his mind racing. What was his full name? He asked, his voice unsteady. Betty glanced up, confused by his sudden urgency. Thomas Rivera, she said. Why? Austin froze, his heart pounding in his ears. The name confirmed what he already feared, but hadn't allowed himself to fully believe. Thomas, his partner, his friend, the man whose death had haunted him for years. He swallowed hard, struggling to maintain composure. No reason, just curious. Betty seemed to accept the answer, returning to her thoughts. But Austin couldn't stay. He rose abruptly, mumbling something about work before retreating to his private quarters. Alone, Austin paced the length of his room, his mind ablaze with memories and guilt. Thomas's laughter, their late nights brainstorming ideas, the fiery arguments that led to the worst night of both their lives. It all came rushing back with a force that left him reeling. He couldn't ignore the truth now. Betty, the woman he'd been trying to help, was Thomas's sister, and she had no idea who he was or the role he had played in her brother's fate. Grabbing his phone, Austin hesitated only a moment before dialing the number of a private investigator he had worked with years ago. I need confirmation on someone, he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil within. Betty Rivera. Find out everything you can. The next day, the investigator's report arrived, and with it, the last shred of doubt vanished. Betty was Thomas's sister. The weight of the revelation bore down on Austin, leaving him grappling with the impossible question of what to do next. As he stared at the report in his hands, the photograph of Thomas on his desk seemed to mock him, a silent reminder of the truth he could no longer escape. The past had found him, and this time, there was no running from it. Austin, consumed by guilt and the burden of his secret, must now decide whether to reveal the truth to Betty, knowing it could shatter the fragile trust they've built. Austin had barely slept in days. The guilt tore at him relentlessly, crashing against the walls he'd constructed to suppress his emotions. His usual composure had slipped, leaving him irritable and distracted. Work meetings blurred together, his responses terse and hollow. Even Betty noticed. "Are you okay?" she asked one evening, her brow furrowed as she stood in the doorway of his office. Austin looked up from the stack of papers he hadn't touched in hours. "I'm fine," he said too quickly, his tone betraying him. Betty hesitated. "You don't look fine. If something's wrong—" "Nothing's wrong." He cut her off, softer this time but still distant. "I've just been tired." Betty didn't press, though concern lingered in her eyes as she turned and left. Austin watched her go, his stomach twisting. She deserved to know the truth. But how could he tell her? How could he look her in the eye and confess that he had been part of the chain of events that led to her brother's death? That night, the city's glow filtered dimly through the curtains of Austin's living room as he paced, rehearsing the words he'd struggled to form for days. The photograph of Thomas on his desk stared back at him, a silent witness to his torment. When he finally heard the creak of footsteps descending the staircase, he turned to see Betty. She was in her usual casual clothes, her expression neutral, but tinged with curiosity. "You're still up?" she asked, folding her arms. Austin hesitated, his hands flexing at his sides. "Betty, can we talk?" Her brow furrowed, but she nodded. "All right." He crossed the room and sat in the chair opposite her, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. For a long moment he said nothing, his thoughts swirling in chaos. Then finally, he spoke. "It's about your brother," he said, his voice trembling. "About Thomas." The mention of her brother's name made her sit up straighter, her expression shifting to one of wary curiosity. "What about him?" Austin took a deep breath, his hands gripping each other tightly. "Thomas and we were business partners," he said, his voice thick with emotion. 7 years ago, we started this company together." Betty's eyes widened, and her lips parted slightly, but she said nothing, waiting for him to continue. "We were close. We had big dreams, big ideas," he said, his gaze dropping to the floor. "But we didn't always agree. One night we had an argument. Stupid, really. I said things I shouldn't have. He stormed out. And that's when it happened." The words came out haltingly, each one feeling heavier than the last. "The accident. It was after he left. And I've blamed myself every day since." Betty stared at him, her face pale and her hands gripping the edge of the couch. "You knew him," she whispered, the words barely audible. Austin nodded, his voice breaking. "I didn't just know him, Betty. I failed him. I let my pride get in the way, and because of that, he's gone." The silence that followed was deafening. Betty's expression shifted, shock, grief, and something else Austin couldn't quite read. "You—" Her voice wavered. "You were there. You—" Her words broke off, and she pressed a hand to her forehead, her breathing uneven. Austin leaned forward, his hands outstretched, but not quite reaching her. "Betty, I'm so sorry," he said, his voice desperate. "If I could go back, if I could change anything, I would. But I can't. All I can do is tell you the truth, now." She stood, abruptly, stepping away from him. Her arms wrapped around herself, and she turned her back, her shoulders trembling. I can't do this right now," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Betty, please," Austin said, rising to his feet. "I didn't want to hide this from you. I didn't know how to tell you." She turned to face him, her eyes glistening with tears. "I need time," she said, her voice firm, despite the tremor in it. "I need to figure out what this means." Austin's heart sank, but he nodded, knowing he couldn't push her. "Take all the time you need," he said quietly. "I'll be here." Without another word, Betty turned and walked toward the door, her steps quick and purposeful. Austin didn't follow. He watched as she disappeared down the hall, the sound of the front door closing echoing through the house. Austin stood in the empty living room, the silence suffocating. The weight of his confession pressed down on him like a physical burden, and the realization that he might have driven Betty away for good settled heavily in his chest. He had done the right thing, but the cost of that truth felt unbearable. Betty's first few days after leaving Austin's house were filled with confusion and uncertainty. She found a room in a modest shared apartment on the edge of the city and threw herself into finding work. Anything to quiet the storm of emotions swirling inside her. It was through sheer chance that she stumbled upon the local social support center. The sign in the window had been small, volunteers needed, but it caught her attention. On a whim, she ventured inside, and within hours, she was organizing canned goods and sorting clothing donations. The work wasn't glamorous, but it was grounding. Betty spent her days helping those who, like her, had known what it meant to feel forgotten. Slowly, as the days turned into weeks, the weight in her chest began to lighten. She found purpose in the smiles of strangers, in the quiet gratitude of people who received something as simple as a warm coat. Yet, despite her growing sense of stability, thoughts of Austin lingered. His confession had shattered the fragile trust she'd built with him, but it hadn't erased the kindness he'd shown her. The memory of his trembling voice as he apologized haunted her. "He's just as broken as I am," she thought more than once, though the thought brought little comfort. For Austin, the days without Betty were heavy and hollow. His home felt emptier than ever, the silence louder than her cautious footsteps or the quiet rustle of her papers. Work provided little distraction, his focus shattered by the void her absence left behind. But Austin respected her need for distance, but his absence didn't mean silence. Each month, Betty received a discreet envelope containing enough money to cover her rent and a little more. No notes accompanied the payments, no demands or explanations. She knew it was from him, and though her pride rebelled at first, she couldn't bring herself to return it. It wasn't charity, it was something else, an act of quiet responsibility. At night, she would sit by her small window, staring out at the city lights and wondering if he was doing the same somewhere across town. Was he still consumed by guilt? Did he regret telling her the truth? One evening, as Betty sorted through boxes of donated books at the center, an elderly woman approached her. "You have a kind touch, dear," the woman said softly, watching as Betty carefully arranged a stack of children's novels. Betty smiled, her fingers lingering on a worn cover. "I just want to help," she replied, her voice steady. The woman nodded knowingly. "Helping others has a way of healing the helper, doesn't it?" The words stayed with Betty long after the woman left. That night, as she sat by the window, she found herself thinking of Thomas, not the pain of losing him, but the joy he'd brought into her life. She remembered his laughter, the way he'd ruffled her hair whenever she doubted herself. He wouldn't have wanted her to live in anger or blame. He'd have wanted her to live. She reached for her phone, scrolling through her messages until she found the last one, from Austin. It was short, just a quiet acknowledgement of her leaving. "Take care of yourself. Always." Her thumb hovered over the screen. She didn't reply, not yet, but for the first time, the knot in her chest loosened. The realization came slowly, like the first rays of sunlight after a long night. Thomas's death had been a tragedy, yes, but not a deliberate act. Austin's role in it, while painful, wasn't malicious. It was human, flawed, messy, and complicated. Just like her. As the weeks turned into months, Betty began to reconcile her feelings. She didn't know if forgiveness would come easily, but she knew she couldn't carry the weight of resentment forever. For now, she would focus on the small victories, helping others, finding her footing, and learning to live again. One evening, as Betty locks up the center, she glances at her phone. The screen is blank, but her finger hovers over Austin's contact. a decision bruise within her, a step toward closure, or perhaps a new beginning. For now, the choice remains hers alone. The social support center hummed with quiet energy, a stark contrast to the chaos it had been when Betty first walked through its doors 2 years earlier. Now, the mismatched furniture and scuffed floors carried an air of purpose, their imperfections a testament to the lives changed within these walls. Betty stood in the center of it all, clipboard in hand, directing volunteers with a confidence that had grown over time. Her once tentative steps were now sure and deliberate, her voice steady as she coordinated the distribution of donations. She had found her place here, not just as a worker, but as a leader. The staff respected her, drawn to her calm demeanor and tireless dedication. Clients looked up to her, sensing her empathy as someone who truly understood their struggles. And Betty, for her part, had discovered a quiet joy in seeing others rise from the places she once knew so well. Yet even amid the fulfillment of her work, Austin lingered in the corners of her thoughts. Although she hadn't seen him since the night she left, his monthly checks continued to arrive punctually. She never cashed them anymore, but she also never returned them. They sat in a neat stack in her desk drawer, a quiet reminder of his enduring presence, even from a distance. That afternoon, as the last of the volunteers packed up for the day, the sound of the center's front door creaking open drew Betty's attention. She looked up, clipboard still in hand, and froze. Austin stood in the doorway, his tall frame silhouetted by the late afternoon sun. He looked different, older, perhaps, though not in the physical sense. There was a softness to him now, a kind of quiet humility that hadn't been there before. "Hi," he said, his voice tentative. Betty nodded slowly, her heartbeat quickening. "Hi." For a moment, neither of them moved, the distance between them filled with unspoken words. Then, Austin stepped forward, his movements careful, as though afraid to intrude. "I heard you were doing incredible work here," he said, gesturing toward the bustling center. "I wanted to see it for myself." Betty set the clipboard down on the table beside her, folding her arms across her chest. "It's a good place," she said simply. "It suits you?" Austin said, his tone genuine. "Helping people. You've always had that in you." Betty studied him, searching his face for the man she once knew. He seemed lighter somehow, less burdened. Yet there was still a weight in his eyes, one that hadn't entirely lifted. "How have you been?" she asked, surprising even herself with the question. Austin hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Trying to be better," he said, "trying to figure out how to live with myself." Her chest tightened at his words, a mix of empathy and unease flooding through her. "And have you?" "Some days are easier than others," he admitted, "but I've learned a lot about myself, about what matters." Betty nodded, unsure of how to respond. The silence between them stretched, but this time it felt less heavy, less charged. Austin took a deep breath, his expression turning serious. "Betty," he said, his voice steady but quiet, "I need to say something. I came here because I owe you more than an apology. I owe you a chance to hear me ask for forgiveness." Her breath caught, but she said nothing, letting him continue. "I know I hurt you," Austin said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I know I can't undo what happened, no matter how much I wish I could. But I want to try, if you'll let me. Not to erase the past, but to build something better, moving forward. With you." Betty's throat tightened as she looked at him, her thoughts a swirl of emotions. She saw the man who had taken her in, who had shown her kindness when she had nothing, but she also saw the man who had unwittingly played a role in her greatest loss. And yet, he was here, asking for a chance, She inhaled deeply, her arms loosening at her sides. "I don't know if I can forgive you yet," she said honestly, her voice soft but firm. "But I believe I'm ready to try." Austin's shoulders relaxed, a small, relieved smile tugging at his lips. That's all I could hope for. As Austin helps Betty lock up the center, their conversation turns to lighter topics, tentative steps toward rebuilding trust. The promise of something new lingers in the air, but the path ahead remains uncertain, leaving both to wonder where it might lead. Over the next few months, Betty and Austin began meeting regularly. At first, their encounters were brief: coffee after her shifts at the center or a walk through the nearby park. Their conversations were tentative, careful not to stray too deeply into the past. But slowly, the initial awkwardness gave way to something warmer, something rooted in mutual understanding. Austin listened as Betty spoke about her work at the center, her eyes lighting up when she described the lives they'd touched. "There's this boy, Aaron," she said one afternoon, smiling softly. "He reminds me of Thomas. Always asking questions, always curious." Austin nodded, leaning forward. Thomas was like that. He had a way of making you believe anything was possible. Betty's smile faltered, and for a moment they sat in silence, the shared memory of Thomas binding them in its bittersweetness. "You know," Austin said carefully, "I've been thinking about starting something, a foundation, for kids like Aaron, to help them get an education, to make sure they don't slip through the cracks." Betty's gaze softened. "That's a good idea," she said quietly. "Thomas would have loved that." Austin nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I'd like you to be part of it, if you want." Her lips parted slightly in surprise. "Me?" "You understand these kids," Austin said simply. "You've lived it. You'd know how to reach them in ways I never could." Betty hesitated, her mind racing. "I don't know if I'm ready for something like that," she admitted. Austin smiled faintly. "You're already doing it, Betty. Every day at the center. This would just be bigger." She looked away, her fingers brushing over the edge of her coffee cup. "I'll think about it," she said finally. "That's all I'm asking," Austin replied. As weeks turned into months, their meetings became a steady rhythm. They shared stories about Thomas, his dreams, his quirks, his flaws. Betty spoke of her childhood with him, the nights he'd stayed up helping her with homework, the way he always found a way to make her laugh. Austin shared tales of their partnership, the late nights brainstorming, the big risks, and the even bigger dreams. "Do you ever feel like he's still here?" Betty asked one evening as they strolled through the park. Austin glanced at her, his brow furrowing slightly. "Sometimes," he said quietly. "In the things I do, in the way I think. It's like he left pieces of himself behind." Betty nodded, her gaze distant. "I used to think he was gone completely. But lately, I don't know. It's like I can feel him again. In the people I help, in the moments when things feel right." Austin stopped walking, his hands in his pockets. "Maybe that's what he wanted," he said softly. "For us to find him in the things we do, in the lives we touch." Betty looked at him, the weight of his words settling over her. For the first time, she felt a sense of peace, not complete, but enough. The foundation took shape faster than Betty expected. Austin poured his resources into it, crafting a vision that honored Thomas's legacy while addressing the needs of vulnerable children. Betty, despite her initial hesitation, found herself drawn into the project. Her insights shaped its programs, her experiences grounding its ambitions in reality. One afternoon, as they finalized plans for the foundation's launch, Austin looked at her across the table. "Thank you," he said simply. Betty frowned slightly. "For what?" "For giving me a second chance," he said, his voice steady. for letting me be part of this." She studied him for a long moment before nodding. "You're making it count," she said quietly. "That's what matters." On the eve of the Foundation's launch, Betty stands in the doorway of Austin's office, holding a framed photo of Thomas that she found in the archives. "I think we should put this up," she says, her voice soft. Austin nods, his gaze lingering on the photo. As they hang it in the Foundation's entrance hall, the weight of their shared journey feels lighter, though neither can ignore the question that lingers between them. Can they truly move forward, together, while honoring the past? The late afternoon sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a golden glow over the rolling hills of the cemetery. The long shadows of the trees stretched across the quiet grounds, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. Austin parked the car near the entrance, his fingers lingering on the steering wheel for a moment before turning to Betty. "Are you ready?" he asked softly. Betty nodded, her gaze fixed on the bouquet of white lilies resting in her lap. "I think so." They stepped out together, the crunch of gravel beneath their shoes, the only sound as they made their way to Thomas's grave. Betty led the way, her steps deliberate, though her grip on the flowers tightened with each one. Austin stayed close behind, his presence steady and reassuring. When they reached the grave, Betty stopped, her breath catching at the sight of her brother's name etched into the polished stone. Thomas Rivera, a beloved brother and dreamer. The words felt both familiar and foreign, a bittersweet reminder of the man he'd been and the years that had passed. Betty knelt, carefully placing the bouquet at the base of the headstone. She brushed her fingers lightly over the engraved letters, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hi, Thomas." Austin stood silently behind her, giving her the space she needed. His hands rested in his pockets, his gaze soft as he looked down at the grave. He hadn't been here in years, the weight of his guilt keeping him away. Now, standing beside Betty, it felt different, less like a burden and more like an opportunity to finally honor Thomas's memory. Betty's voice broke the silence. "I've been thinking about you a lot," she said, her words steady despite the emotion behind them. "About everything you taught me. About how much I miss you." She paused, her fingers curling into the grass. "I've been angry for so long. At the world, at myself, even at you. But I think I understand now. You wouldn't want that. You'd want me to find peace, to live." Her voice wavered, but she pressed on. "I'm trying, Thomas, I really am. And Austin. He's trying too." Austin's breath hitched, the mention of his name catching him off guard. Betty glanced back at him, her expression unreadable. "Do you want to say something?" she asked. Austin hesitated, stepping closer before kneeling beside her. His eyes were fixed on the headstone as he spoke. "Thomas, I owe you more than an apology," he began, his voice heavy with emotion. "I made mistakes that cost you everything, and I've carried that with me every day since. But Betty's right. You wouldn't want us to stay stuck in the past." He swallowed hard, his voice softening. "We're building something for you, a foundation to help kids like us, kids with dreams as big as yours. I hope it's something you'd be proud of." Betty's hand brushed against his, a small, silent gesture of solidarity. For a moment, they knelt together, the weight of their shared grief balanced by the quiet comfort of each other's presence. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Betty stood, brushing the grass from her knees. Austin rose beside her, his gaze lingering on the headstone one last time. "Thank you," Betty said quietly, her eyes on the flowers. "For everything." Austin turned to her, his expression both tentative and hopeful. "Do you think you'd be okay with us?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Betty met his gaze, her lips curving into a small, bittersweet smile. "I think he'd want us to be happy." The answer settled between them like a promise. Austin extended his hand, and after a brief hesitation, Betty took it. Together, they began the slow walk back to the car, the cemetery fading behind them as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. The air was cool and crisp, carrying with it a sense of renewal. Betty's grip on Austin's hand tightened slightly, and he responded in kind, a silent acknowledgement of the path they'd walked to get here, and the one they were about to begin. As they reached the car, Betty glanced back at the hill where Thomas rested, her heart lighter than it had been in years. For the first time, she felt the possibility of healing, of hope, of a future unshackled by the weight of the past. And as they drove away, the road stretching out before them, the sunset gave way to the quiet glow of moonlight, illuminating the start of a new chapter, one they would write together. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.